The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that stretched so tight, you could feel it pressing against your chest. The judge, a seasoned woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had just lifted her gavel. The defendant, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit, sat at the stand, his hands folded neatly on the table before him, though the tension in his shoulders was impossible to ignore. Then, out of nowhere, a voice, small, clear, yet powerful. "Excuse me, Your Honor." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Heads turned, eyes widened. The judge's gavel froze midair. There, standing just beyond the wooden railing, was a little girl, no older than 7, with dark curls framing her round face, dressed in a simple pink dress with white sneakers. Her hands were clenched into tiny fists at her sides, her expression a mixture of determination and fear. Judge Caroline Foster blinked. "Young lady," she said, her voice measured, "this is a courtroom. You cannot interrupt a trial." The girl hesitated, but only for a second. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto the defendant, the man sitting at the table, the one who had been fighting to prove his innocence. "You're lying," the girl said, her voice steady. "I saw you." The room exploded. Murmurs, whispers, the sharp intake of breath from the jurors. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate. Who is this child?" The man in the navy suit, the one on trial, had gone pale. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His fingers, once neatly folded, curled into the fabric of his pants. "Bailiff," Judge Foster said, her voice firm. "Get this child out of here." "No," the girl shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. "I have to say this. I saw what happened. I saw." The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and a woman burst in, her face stricken with panic. "Emma!" the woman cried, rushing forward. "Emma, stop!" The bailiff intercepted the child, gripping her gently by the shoulders, but Emma thrashed in his grasp. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wasn't backing down. "He did it," Emma sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at the defendant. "I saw him do it." A hush fell over the room. The judge's eyes flickered from Emma to the accused man, her jaw tightening. She set the gavel down and leaned forward. "Who are you, young lady?" she asked. Emma gulped, glancing at the woman, the one who had run in, presumably her mother. Then, she turned back to the judge. "I'm Emma Parker," she said softly, wiping at her eyes. "And I know the truth about Mr. Langston." The defendant, Mr. Langston, flinched at his name. His attorney whispered something furiously in his ear, but Langston just sat there, rigid. Judge Foster studied the girl, then straightened. "Bailiff," she said, her tone grave, "let her go." The courtroom was still, as if the very air had thickened. Emma took a deep breath, then turned to the room. And with all eyes on her, she uttered a sentence that would change everything. "I know what he did to my dad." The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. No one dared to move. No one even breathed. Judge Foster's gaze sharpened. "Your father," she repeated, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "What do you mean, young lady?" Emma hesitated. She glanced at her mother, who was now frozen in place, her face a mask of shock and fear. Mr. Langston, the defendant, clenched his jaw. His hands curled into fists on the table, his knuckles white. His attorney muttered something urgently in his ear, but Langston didn't respond. He was staring straight at Emma, his expression unreadable. Emma's voice cracked. She was trembling now, but she swallowed hard and forced herself to continue. "My dad, James Parker. He's gone. He disappeared 6 months ago." Her lips wobbled. "But I know why. I know what happened." Judge Foster sat back, her expression unreadable. "Bailiff, bring the girl a chair." A wooden chair was placed just inside the witness box, and Emma was gently helped onto it. Her mother, however, was shaking her head. "Your Honor, please," she pleaded, stepping forward. "She's just a child. She doesn't know." Judge Foster lifted a hand. "Mrs. Parker, I will decide that. If your daughter has information relevant to this case, I need to hear it." Mrs. Parker paled, but she didn't argue. She looked at Emma with desperate eyes, silently begging her to stop. But Emma was already speaking again. My dad knew Mr. Langston, Emma said, staring straight at the man on trial. They worked together. My dad always said Mr. Langston was a bad man. He said he was dangerous. Langston's attorney stood up abruptly. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. The child is not a sworn witness. We don't even know if... Judge Foster silenced him with a sharp look. Sit down, Mr. Pearson. I want to hear this. Pearson hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his expression dark. Emma continued, gripping the edges of her dress with tiny hands. A few days before my dad went missing, he told my mom that he found something big. He said it had to do with Mr. Langston. He was scared. She turned her gaze toward the judge. And then one night, he left. He told me he was just going to the store. Her lip quivered. He never came back. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Judge Foster's eyes narrowed. Emma, are you saying you believe Mr. Langston had something to do with your father's disappearance? Emma nodded slowly, her small hands balling into fists. I know he did. Langston finally reacted. He let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. This is ridiculous, he muttered. This kid, she's making things up. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But Emma ignored him. Her gaze was locked onto the judge. I didn't know what happened to my dad. Not at first. But then, a few weeks ago, I found something. The judge leaned forward. What did you find? Emma took a shaky breath. My dad's old phone. Langston's eyes widened slightly. His fingers twitched against the table. The reaction wasn't lost on Judge Foster. Where did you find it? Emma hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. Under the floorboard in our basement. He must have hidden it before he left that night. Now the room was really buzzing. The prosecutor's ears perked up. The jury exchanged glances. Judge Foster raised a hand to calm the murmurs. And what was on the phone, Emma? Emma's lower lip trembled, but her gaze was steady. A recording, she whispered. The tension in the room spiked. Judge Foster's expression darkened. A recording of what? Emma turned to Langston. You. Langston's breath hitched. His face lost what little color remained. Emma clenched her fists. A recording of you and my dad. He was scared. He was telling you he knew what you did. She swallowed hard. And you told him that if he said anything, he'd never see his family again. The courtroom was in chaos now. People whispering, gasping, some even standing to get a better look at Langston. The judge's gavel slammed against the wood. Order! But even over the noise, one thing was clear. Langston wasn't denying it. Instead, for the first time since the trial began, he looked terrified. The weight of Emma's words settled over the courtroom like a dense fog. The room wasn't just silent, it felt frozen. Every eye was locked onto Langston. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His fingers twitched as if he wanted to reach for something. His tie, his attorney's arm, anything, but he forced his hands flat against the table instead. Judge Foster's gaze was ice-cold. Mr. Langston, she said, her voice sharp, is this true? Langston's mouth opened, then shut. His lawyer, Mr. Pearson, leaned in, whispering urgently in his ear, but Langston just sat there, his breathing uneven. Emma gripped the wooden edge of the witness stand. He told my dad to keep quiet about something. And now, my dad is gone. Her voice wavered, but she stayed strong. I have the recording. Gasps erupted. The prosecutor bolted upright. Judge Foster's eyebrows shot up. You have it. Emma nodded. I brought the phone with me. Slowly, she reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out an old, cracked smartphone. She gripped it tightly, as if she were afraid someone would snatch it away. Judge Foster motioned to the bailiff. Bring it here. The bailiff, moving with the careful precision of a bomb technician, stepped forward and took the phone from Emma's outstretched hand. He walked it over to the judge, who placed it down in front of her and studied it. Can you play the recording? She asked. Emma nodded quickly. It's saved on the voice recorder app. It's the last one. Judge Foster turned to the courtroom technician. Get this connected to the speakers. Pearson shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I strongly object. This is highly improper. We have no way of verifying the authenticity of this recording." The prosecutor cut in, standing as well. "Your Honor, this could be crucial evidence. If this recording contains what the witness claims, it must be heard." Judge Foster considered the arguments for a long moment. Finally, she turned to Pearson. "Mr. Pearson, if this recording is false or tampered with, that will be addressed. But for now, I want to hear it." Pearson clenched his jaw, then sat down with a frustrated sigh. Langston hadn't moved. He was still stiff, his gaze flicking between Emma and the phone. A courtroom technician took the device, plugged it into the speaker system, and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, a voice, low, urgent, and trembling. "Langston, listen to me. I know what you did." A chill ran through the room. Emma inhaled sharply. "That's my dad." The voice continued. "You think no one will find out, but I know. I have proof. Just tell me the truth. Why did you do it?" Then, another voice. Langston's voice. "You don't understand what you're messing with, Parker. If you open your mouth, you'll never see your family again." A collective gasp rang out. Even the jurors, who had been stoic all trial, looked visibly shaken. The recording crackled again. "I don't care," Parker's voice whispered. "I'm going to the police." And then, a loud crash. A scuffle. A muffled shout. Then silence. The recording stopped. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The air in the courtroom was thick with unspoken horror. Langston's face had gone ashen. His hands clenched so tightly on the table that his nails dug into the wood. Judge Foster exhaled slowly, her eyes locked onto him. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice grave, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" Pearson leaned forward, hissing something in Langston's ear. But Langston wasn't listening anymore. His gaze darted toward Emma, then the jury, then the judge. His breaths were coming in short, panicked bursts. His voice cracked. This isn't." Before he could finish, the courtroom doors burst open. A police officer rushed in, flanked by two more behind him. He marched straight toward the judge's bench and handed her a document. Judge Foster skimmed the paper. Then, she looked back up, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice steady. "New evidence has surfaced. A warrant for your arrest has just been issued." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, whispers of, "Oh my God," filled the space. Langston shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane," he bellowed. "I didn't." Before he could move, the officers closed in. One gripped his wrist, snapping a pair of handcuffs around them with practiced efficiency. Emma watched, her eyes wide, as the man who had haunted her nightmares was restrained. As Langston was being led out, he turned his head, just slightly, his eyes locking onto Emma. And then, with a quiet, chilling smirk, he muttered something under his breath. A single sentence that sent ice down her spine. "This isn't over." The smirk. The words. The way Langston's cold eyes lingered on Emma as he was dragged away, it sent a deep, twisting fear through her chest. Her mother, Mrs. Parker, was at her side in an instant, wrapping protective arms around her. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. "It's over." But Emma wasn't so sure. Even as Langston was taken through the courtroom doors, his last words echoed in her head. "This isn't over." The judge's gavel struck the bench, demanding order. The murmurs quieted. Judge Foster sighed, rubbing her temple. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice firm, "this trial will be postponed for further investigation. Given this new evidence, Mr. Langston is now facing additional charges. Court is adjourned." The gavel hit again. But the tension in the air didn't disappear. Emma felt dozens of eyes on her. Lawyers, jurors, spectators. Even the prosecutor was looking at her like she had just changed the entire course of history. And maybe she had. A uniformed officer approached Judge Foster and leaned in, whispering something in her ear. The judge's already stern expression darkened. She gave a small nod, then looked at Emma and her mother. "Mrs. Parker," she said, May I speak with you and your daughter in my chambers? Emma's mom hesitated. Oh, of course. They followed the judge through a side door, leaving the chaos of the courtroom behind. Judge Foster's chambers. Judge Foster's office was grand but intimidating. Dark wooden shelves lined with legal books, a large desk covered in neatly stacked papers. She gestured for Emma and her mother to sit in the 2 chairs across from her. The judge folded her hands. Emma, she said, do you understand how serious what you just did was? Emma swallowed. Yes, ma'am. You may have just provided critical evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation. Judge Foster studied her for a long moment. But that also means you may be in danger. Mrs. Parker inhaled sharply. Danger. The officer who had spoken to the judge earlier stepped forward. Ma'am, he addressed Emma's mother, we have reason to believe that Mr. Langston has connections outside of this courtroom. Powerful ones. Mrs. Parker's grip on Emma tightened. Are you saying someone else might come after us? The officer hesitated before answering. We can't rule it out. A thick, heavy silence filled the room. Emma's stomach twisted. She knew Langston was bad, but she hadn't thought about what came next. She had only wanted the truth. Judge Foster exhaled. For now, we will be placing you under protective custody. That means a secure location where no one, including Mr. Langston's associates, can find you. Emma's mom looked horrified. You mean we have to leave our home? It's for your safety, the officer said. At least until we can confirm there's no immediate threat. Emma glanced at her mom, guilt pressing against her chest. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean for this to happen. Her mother turned to her, shaking her head. No, baby. You did the right thing. She pulled Emma into a tight embrace. I'm just scared. Judge Foster cleared her throat. An officer will escort you to a secure location immediately. She paused, glancing at Emma. You're very brave, young lady. Your father would be proud. Emma's throat tightened. She nodded, blinking rapidly to hold back the tears. A knock at the door made everyone jump. Another officer entered, looking tense. We have a situation, he said grimly. Judge Foster stood. What is it? The officer hesitated. Then Langston escaped. Everything stopped. Emma felt her heart slam against her ribs. Her mother gasped, gripping her hand. No, she breathed. That's not possible. Judge Foster's jaw clenched. How? The officer shook his head. The transport vehicle was attacked on the way to the holding facility. The officers were overpowered. He's gone. Panic shot through Emma's veins like ice. He was free. Judge Foster turned to the officer at their side. Get them out of here. Now. Emma barely had time to react before she was yanked from her chair. Officers surrounded them, escorting them quickly down the hallway. Her mind was spinning. Langston was free. And the last thing he had said to her was, "This isn't over." The world around Emma blurred into chaos. Officers barked orders. Walkie-talkies crackled with urgent voices. People rushed past in a frenzy, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Langston was gone. Emma clutched her mother's hand as they were hurried through a back hallway of the courthouse. A team of officers flanked them, their hands hovering over their holsters, eyes darting around as if Langston himself might appear at any moment. Judge Foster followed closely behind, her expression steely. "We're taking no chances," she told them firmly. "You and your daughter are being moved immediately." Mrs. Parker, still trembling, nodded. "Where?" The lead officer didn't answer. "We need to keep that information confidential for now." Emma's throat was dry. She could still see Langston's smirk in her mind, the way he had known something before anyone else did. Had he planned this escape all along? Was there someone helping him? They were ushered into a private elevator. As soon as the doors slid shut, Emma's mother exhaled shakily, gripping Emma even tighter. "We're safe, right?" No one answered right away. "Then, for now," the officer finally said. Emma didn't like the sound of that. Outside the courthouse. The moment they stepped into the underground parking garage, the air felt different. Heavy. Dangerous. A black SUV idled a few feet away. An officer pulled the door open. "Get in." Mrs. Parker hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Shouldn't we?" The lead officer cut her off. "No." Emma was practically lifted into the back seat. Her mom scrambled in after her. The door slammed shut, and almost immediately, the SUV peeled out of the parking lot, heading toward an unknown destination. The ride was silent at first. The officer in the front passenger seat turned to speak, his eyes serious. "We're taking you somewhere safe. No one except our team knows where you're going. You'll have everything you need until Langston is found." Emma glanced at her mom, who was wringing her hands in her lap. "How did he escape?" Emma asked suddenly. The officer sighed. The transport vehicle was ambushed. 2 masked men took out the drivers and freed Langston before reinforcements arrived. A cold shiver ran down Emma's spine. "So, someone's helping him?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," the officer admitted. "But it means he's not working alone." Emma's hands clenched. She didn't like this. Not one bit. The car turned onto a highway, speeding past road signs too fast to read. The tinted windows made it hard to see where they were going, but one thing was clear: they were leaving the city. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then, the driver cursed under his breath. "What is it?" the officer asked. Emma's stomach twisted as the driver's hands tightened on the wheel. "We're being followed." Her mother sucked in a breath. "What?" Emma twisted around, her heart racing. A dark-colored sedan had appeared in the distance behind them. It wasn't too close, but it was keeping pace, matching every turn they made. The officer in the front seat grabbed his radio. "We have a tail." "I repeat, we have a tail." Static. Then a voice. Confirmed. "Do not engage. Maintain course." Emma's pulse pounded. "Is it him?" The officer didn't answer. Then, the car behind them suddenly accelerated. In an instant, everything erupted. The sedan rammed into the back of their SUV, sending them jerking forward. Emma screamed as her seatbelt locked against her chest. "Hold on!" the driver yelled, swerving hard. The SUV veered off the highway onto a side road, tires screeching. The sedan followed. Another hard hit sent the SUV skidding onto gravel. The officer in the passenger seat grabbed his radio again. "We need backup now." Static. No response. Emma's breath came fast and shallow. Her mom clutched her hand, knuckles white. Then, bam! The car behind them struck again, harder this time. The SUV fishtailed, spinning wildly. Emma's vision blurred as everything tilted. Then, crash. The world went black. Some time later, Emma woke up to pain. A dull, throbbing ache in her head. The sharp sting of a seatbelt digging into her shoulder. The SUV was on its side, steam hissing from the wrecked hood. Glass littered the ground. Her mother groaned beside her, dazed but conscious. "Emma!" "I'm here," Emma croaked. The officers in the front weren't moving. Emma's breath caught. "Mom." Then, footsteps. Crunching on gravel. Slow. Deliberate. A shadow moved outside the broken windshield. Emma's blood ran cold. And then, a voice. Low. Calm. Familiar. "Told you this wasn't over." Wow. What a moment. If you've made it this far, drop a comment below. What would you do if you were in Emma's situation? Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends, because trust me, things are about to get even crazier. The world around Emma was spinning. Her head pounded, her body ached, and the sharp metallic scent of blood mixed with the smoky air from the wrecked SUV. But none of that mattered. Because he was here. Langston. He stood just beyond the shattered windshield, his figure silhouetted by the headlights of the crashed sedan. His expression was eerily calm, like a man who had already won. Emma's breath hitched. She tried to move, but the seatbelt held her in place. Beside her, her mother groaned, still disoriented from the crash. Langston took a step closer. Then another. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel. "Think, Emma. Think." She forced herself to stay still, to breathe through the panic clawing at her chest. Maybe if she pretended to be unconscious. Too late. Langston crouched down, peering through the broken glass. His eyes locked onto hers. And then, That same unsettling smirk curved across his lips. "I have to admit," he murmured, "I didn't expect you to be this much trouble." Emma swallowed hard. Where's the police?" she stammered, trying to buy time. "They know we were attacked." Langston chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you?" He gestured around. "No one's coming, kid." Her stomach twisted. "You see," Langston continued, his voice silky smooth, "I have friends in high places. That little recording of yours, it put me in a tight spot. But nothing I can't fix." Emma's hands curled into fists. "You killed my dad," she whispered. His smirk faded. "Your father," he said, "should have known when to quit." His eyes darkened. "You should too." Emma's heart pounded. No, I can't let him win." Langston reached forward, gripping the mangled door handle. He pulled. The metal groaned in protest, but it started to bend. Emma's mind raced. She had seconds before he got inside. Then, her eyes landed on something. The radio. The SUV's dashboard radio was still flickering with life, crackling in and out. A direct line to the dispatch. Her fingers darted toward it, fumbling with the buttons. Langston saw. His smirk disappeared. "Don't," he warned. Emma slammed the button. "Help!" she screamed into the radio. "This is Emma Parker. We're under attack." Langston lunged. His hand snatched the radio cord and ripped it from the dashboard. The small device sparked and fell lifelessly to the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Langston let out a slow, annoyed sigh. "Wrong move," he murmured. He reached inside, grabbed Emma by the arm, and yanked. She screamed as she was dragged from the wreckage, her mother's frantic voice calling her name. Langston's grip was like iron. He hauled her to her feet, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "Let's go for a little ride." Emma thrashed, kicking wildly, but he was too strong. He lifted her off the ground as if she weighed nothing. "No!" her mother shrieked. "Let her go." Langston ignored her. He turned toward the sedan, the one that had rammed them off the road. A man was standing by the passenger door, watching. A large man, dressed in black, face hidden under the shadows of a baseball cap. "Get the car ready," Langston ordered. The man nodded, moving swiftly. The sedan's back door opened. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps. No. She had to stop this. In one desperate motion, she swung her free arm backward, her elbow slamming into Langston's ribs. He grunted, momentarily loosening his grip. It was all she needed. Emma twisted, kicked, and broke free. She stumbled back, legs shaking. Her mom was still trapped in the SUV. The officers weren't moving, probably knocked out cold. No one was coming to save her. She had to save herself. Langston recovered quickly, his expression darkening. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Emma turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the gravel as she sprinted toward the darkness of the woods. Branches whipped against her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind her, she heard Langston snarl, "Get her!" Heavy footsteps followed. Fast. Too fast. Panic clawed at her throat. She darted between trees, her lungs burning. She had no plan, no idea where she was going. Just one desperate goal: stay ahead. A branch snapped behind her. Closer. Then, a pair of hands grabbed her shoulders. She screamed, kicking wildly. The hands spun her around. And in the faint moonlight, she saw who had caught her. Not Langston. Not the man in the baseball cap. But someone she never expected. Someone who shouldn't have been there at all. And the words that left their mouth made her blood turn to ice. "Emma, I know where your father is." Emma's heart nearly stopped. The hands gripping her shoulders weren't rough like Langston's. They weren't forceful. They were steady, firm. And when she looked up into the stranger's face, her breath caught. He was tall, scruffy, and had deep, tired eyes. His clothes were worn, his jacket stained with dirt, but his face was familiar. Too familiar. Emma's body locked up, her brain refusing to believe what her eyes were telling her. Because the man standing in front of her, The one who had just saved her from Langston was her father. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Dad," she finally choked out, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man's jaw clenched. "No time to explain, sweetheart," he said urgently. "We have to go. Now." Emma didn't move. This isn't real. It couldn't be. He was gone. Langston made sure of that. And yet, her father, James Parker, was standing right in front of her. Alive. Behind them, Langston's voice rang out in the darkness. "Emma," he bellowed. "Come back here now." The shout snapped her back to reality. James grabbed her hand. "We need to run." Emma's body finally obeyed. Together, they bolted deeper into the woods. Branches slapped at her face as they ran, her feet stumbling over roots and rocks. But her father's grip was strong, guiding her through the dense trees as if he knew exactly where to go. Behind them, Langston and his men crashed through the undergrowth. "She's not alone," one of them shouted. Langston cursed. "Find them." James yanked Emma's hand, pulling her toward a large fallen tree. "Over here." He lifted her up and helped her climb over before following close behind. They ran, and ran, and ran, until, finally, James skidded to a stop near a cluster of old cabins. Emma gasped for air, her lungs burning. Where are we?" James didn't answer right away. He crouched low, scanning the woods, listening for any sign of pursuit. Then, satisfied they weren't being followed, he finally looked at her. His eyes softened. "Emma, it's really me." Tears burned behind her eyes. She should have had a million questions. She should have demanded answers, screamed at him for disappearing, for letting her believe he was dead. But all she could do was collapse into his arms. He held her tight, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'm so sorry, baby girl." A sob escaped her throat. "I thought you were gone." "I almost was," James admitted. "But I had to disappear." His face darkened. "Because of him." Emma pulled back. "Langston." James nodded grimly. "He tried to kill me that night." His jaw tightened. "I barely made it out alive." Emma's stomach twisted. "Then why didn't you come home? Why let us think?" "Because if I did," James interrupted, his voice thick with regret, "Langston would have come after you and your mom." Emma swallowed hard. All this time, she had thought she'd been fighting for justice, for the truth. But the truth was, her father had been alive. Hiding. "Where have you been?" she whispered. James hesitated, glancing around as if deciding how much to tell her. "Lying low. Staying off the grid. But when I heard you were testifying against Langston, I knew he'd come for you." Emma's breath hitched. "You came back to save me?" His eyes softened. "Always." A lump formed in her throat. But before she could say another word, a gunshot rang out. Bang! Emma yelped as the sound echoed through the trees. James pushed her behind him, his entire body tensing. Then, voices. Langston's men. "They went this way." Emma's pulse spiked. James cursed under his breath. "We have to move." He grabbed her hand, but before they could take a step, a shadow emerged from the trees, and Langston stepped into the clearing. Emma's stomach dropped. Langston's suit was dirted from the chase, his tie loosened, but his expression was pure rage. He was done playing games. Well, he drawled, straightening. His eyes flicked between them. The long-lost James Parker. James' hand tightened around Emma's. "It's over, Langston." Langston chuckled. "You think it's over?" His gaze slid to Emma. "You're smarter than that, aren't you, kid?" Emma's hands balled into fists. "I'll admit," Langston continued, stepping forward, "you've been a real thorn in my side." His eyes glinted. "But this is where your little hero story ends." He raised a gun. Emma's breath caught. James shoved her behind him. "Emma, run." "No," she whispered. She couldn't just leave him again. Langston's finger tightened on the trigger. Then, another gunshot. Bang. But this time, it wasn't Langston who fired. It was someone behind him. Langston staggered forward, eyes wide. Blood blossomed across his shoulder. His gun clattered to the ground. Emma's eyes darted past him, to the person standing behind him. It was the officer from the courthouse. The one who had been driving the SUV. He was alive. And he was holding a smoking gun. Langston collapsed. Emma's chest heaved. Was it over? Was he finally? But Langston let out a weak, chilling chuckle. You think this ends with me? His voice was barely a whisper. You have no idea what's coming. His head lolled to the side. His body slumped. And then, he was still. Emma's legs gave out. James caught her just before she hit the ground. Is he? She whispered. James exhaled. Yeah. The officer stepped forward, gun still raised. Backup's on the way, he said. It's over. Emma's heart was racing. Langston was gone. But his last words haunted her. You have no idea what's coming. The distant sound of sirens echoed through the trees, but Emma barely heard them. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Langston's body lay still on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. His final words swirled in her head, his voice an eerie whisper. You have no idea what's coming. What did he mean? Emma looked up at her father, still struggling to process the fact that he was even here. Alive. Breathing. Holding her like he had never left. Her fingers tightened in his jacket. Is it really over? James hesitated. His eyes flickered to the fallen gun near Langston's hand, then back to Emma. I don't know, he admitted. The officer who had shot Langston stepped forward, lowering his weapon. Backup is minutes away, he said. But we need to get you two out of here. Emma's mom. Her head snapped toward the wrecked SUV. Mom, she gasped. She tried to move, but James stopped her. She's safe, he promised. We'll get to her. The officer pressed a hand to his earpiece. This is Officer Blake. Suspect is down. Repeat, suspect is down. A pause, then a response crackled through. Copy that. Evac team inbound. Blake exhaled, then turned to Emma and James. We need to go now. James gave a sharp nod, but before they could move, a phone rang. Everyone froze. The sound wasn't coming from any of them. It was coming from Langston's pocket. Emma's breath caught. Slowly, Officer Blake stepped forward and reached into Langston's jacket. He pulled out a sleek, black burner phone, the screen glowing. An unknown number was calling. Blake hesitated, then tapped the answer button. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep, calm voice came through the speaker. You failed, Langston. Emma's stomach dropped. James tensed beside her. Blake didn't say a word. He just held the phone closer. The voice on the line continued. And now it's my turn. Then, the line went dead. Blake stared at the phone. Emma felt her hands shaking. James cursed under his breath. Who the hell was that? Blake's jaw clenched. I don't know. Emma swallowed hard. But they knew Langston. Which means... James finished for her. Which means Langston wasn't the one in charge. A cold dread settled over them. Langston had been powerful. Dangerous. But if he was just a pawn in something bigger, who was really pulling the strings? The sirens grew closer. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the dark forest as several police SUVs screeched to a stop. Officers flooded the area. Emma's mother, alive but shaken, was being helped out of the wrecked vehicle. The moment she saw Emma, she ran. She pulled her into a crushing hug, sobbing. Oh my God, baby. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder. She should have felt relieved. Should have felt safe. But she didn't. Because in the back of her mind, she kept hearing Langston's last words. You have no idea what's coming. And now, after that phone call, she was starting to believe him. The flashing lights from police vehicles painted the trees in streaks of red and blue, but Emma barely noticed. Her mind was spinning. The phone call. The voice. You failed, Langston. And now it's my turn. Who was that? Langston was powerful, but he wasn't the top of the chain. Someone else was pulling the strings. And now that Langston was dead, that someone was coming. Emma clung to her mother, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume. But even as her mom held her tight, whispering reassurances, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over. James stood beside them, his arms crossed, his expression dark. Officer Blake was speaking with a group of higher-ranking officers near Langston's body, his voice low and urgent. Then, Blake turned back to them. "We need to get you all out of here," he said. His voice was firm, but there was something in his eyes, something uneasy. "Now." Emma's mother frowned. "We're under police protection, aren't we? Shouldn't we be safe?" Blake hesitated. "We thought Langston was the problem," he admitted. "But after that call," he shook his head. "We don't know what we're dealing with." James exhaled sharply. "So what's the plan?" Blake gestured toward a waiting vehicle. "We're taking you somewhere more secure. No one, not even other officers, will know where you are until we figure out who was behind Langston." Emma and her mother exchanged a glance. This wasn't over. It was just getting worse. Reluctantly, they climbed into the black SUV. James followed, sitting beside Emma, his eyes constantly scanning the darkened forest as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. The vehicle pulled away, the police escort surrounding them as they left the crash site behind. On the road, the drive was tense. No one spoke for a long time. Emma stared out the window, her mind racing. If Langston wasn't the one in charge, then who was? What had her father uncovered all those months ago? What was so dangerous that Langston had been willing to kill over it? She turned to James. "Dad," she hesitated. "What did you find?" James didn't answer right away. He stared at the road ahead, his jaw tight. "It was bigger than I thought," he admitted. "I started looking into Langston because of some shady business deals. But the deeper I dug, the worse it got." Emma leaned forward. "Worse how?" James sighed. "Langston was laundering money, sure. But it wasn't just about him. He was working for someone. A group. People with power. Influence." He looked at her. "People who don't like loose ends." Emma's stomach twisted. "And now that Langston is dead." James nodded grimly. "They'll be looking for the next loose end." Emma gulped. She was the one who had exposed Langston. She was the next loose end. Suddenly, the SUV jerked violently. Emma screamed as her seatbelt locked against her chest. "What the hell?" James shouted. The driver gritted his teeth. "Something's wrong." Blake grabbed his radio. "Escort team, report. Static. Gunfire. Bang, bang, bang." Emma's breath caught as bullets ripped through the police cars ahead of them. The lead vehicle swerved violently off the road, slamming into a tree. The SUV skidded to a halt as masked men emerged from the forest, armed. Emma's body locked up in terror. James reacted first. "Down. Get down." He yanked Emma and her mother onto the floor of the SUV just as more bullets tore through the windows. Blake pulled out his gun. "We're under attack." The driver cursed. "We can't stay here. Drive," Blake ordered. The SUV lurched forward, tires kicking up dirt. But the attackers were already moving, closing in fast. Emma's heart pounded. This wasn't random. This wasn't just an ambush. They knew exactly who they were after. A masked man sprinted toward the vehicle, aiming a rifle at the windshield. Blake barely hesitated. He fired. The man collapsed. But more were coming. Blake turned to James. "You still know how to handle a gun?" James's eyes darkened. "Give me one." Blake tossed him a spare weapon. Without hesitation, James threw the SUV door open and fired. More gunshots rang out. Emma flinched, covering her ears. Her mother grabbed her hand, her voice shaking. "It's okay, baby. It's okay." Emma wasn't so sure. The SUV swerved. Another police car exploded in flames. They were getting surrounded. James's jaw clenched. "We can't fight them all." Blake nodded. "Then we don't." He grabbed the wheel and jerked it hard. The SUV spun off the road, plowing through the trees. Emma screamed as branches slammed against the windows, the tires struggling for grip. Then, a drop. The SUV hit something steep. It started to slide. Emma's stomach plummeted as they tumbled down a hill. Glass shattered. The vehicle flipped. Then, blackness. Some time later, Emma's head throbbed. She blinked, her vision blurry. The world was tilted. The SUV had crashed. Smoke curled from the hood. The windshield was shattered. Somewhere nearby, she heard her mother groan. But something was wrong. It was too quiet. She twisted, searching the wreckage. "Dad." No answer. Her heartbeat sped up. "Blake," she whispered. Still nothing. Panic set in. She scrambled to undo her seatbelt, crawling out of the overturned vehicle. The air was cold. The smell of burning metal filled her nose. And then, a figure moved in the shadows. Not her dad. Not Officer Blake. Someone else. Emma froze as a masked man stepped forward, watching her. She barely had time to react before he reached down, grabbed her by the arm, and yanked her away from the wreckage. Her scream was muffled. Her mother's voice, far away. Then, everything faded, and the last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her whole was a chilling whisper in her ear. "You were never supposed to survive this long." Darkness. Cold air pressed against Emma's skin. A damp, musty smell filled her nose. Somewhere in the distance, a faint, rhythmic drip echoed off unseen walls. She was awake. But she wasn't free. Her wrists ached. When she tried to move, something cut into her skin, zip ties. Her ankles were bound, too. A thick strip of tape covered her mouth, muffling her panicked breaths. She wasn't alone. Shadows moved beyond the dim light of a flickering bulb. Two figures. One standing, the other pacing. "She's awake," a deep voice muttered. Emma's heart pounded. The standing figure took a step closer. He was tall, dressed in dark tactical gear, a black ski mask hiding his face. But his eyes, cold, calculating, were visible. The same voice from the phone call. The real person behind everything. Not Langston. Someone worse. Emma struggled against her bindings, but the masked man only chuckled. "Brave little girl," he mused. "I can see why Langston was so frustrated with you." Emma's breathing was rapid. Where was her mom? Where was her dad? Were they still alive? The second man, shorter, bulkier, grunted. "We should have finished this weeks ago." The leader ignored him, crouching in front of Emma. His gaze bore into hers. "You caused a lot of problems for us, Emma Parker." She glared at him, refusing to look afraid. He smirked. "You remind me of your father." Emma froze. He knew her dad. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "He worked for us, you know." Emma's mind reeled. "What? No. That couldn't be true." "You don't believe me," the man noted, tilting his head. "Smart girl. But tell me, Emma, how do you think your father uncovered all that information on Langston? How do you think he survived all these months?" Emma's stomach twisted. "No. He's lying. He has to be." The man chuckled, seeing the doubt flicker in her eyes. "Your father isn't the hero you think he is." Emma squeezed her eyes shut. "He's trying to break me. I won't let him." The shorter man, impatient, scoffed. "Enough talking. The boss wants this done." A loud bang echoed through the room. The door burst open. Gunfire. Shouting. Chaos exploded. Emma flinched as bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls. The leader cursed, spinning around just as a familiar voice shouted, "Get away from my daughter." James Parker. Emma's heart soared. Her father was alive. The shorter man reached for his gun, but a single shot rang out. He collapsed. The leader snarled and lunged for Emma. "No, no, no." Bang. A gunshot tore through his shoulder. He stumbled back with a howl, gripping the wound. Emma's bindings were suddenly cut. Strong hands pulled her up. Her father. "Dad." "No time, baby," James said urgently, yanking the tape from her mouth. "We have to go." More gunshots. More voices. The warehouse exploded into motion. Blake and a team of officers stormed in, pinning the remaining attackers to the ground. James gripped Emma's face. Are you hurt? Emma shook her head, eyes wide. Mom, where's Mom? His expression tightened. She's safe. She's waiting for you outside. Relief crashed over her. But before they could move, the wounded leader groaned, lifting his head. His eyes met Emma's. Blood dripped from his mouth, but his voice was still strong, still full of power. You think this is over? He rasped. James tensed, gun still raised. Shut up. The man smirked. You have no idea what's coming. A horrific beeping sound filled the air. Emma's heart stopped. James's eyes widened. A bomb. Run! Blake yelled. James grabbed Emma and sprinted toward the exit. The beeping sped up, faster, faster. Then, boom. After the explosion, Emma's ears rang. Dust. Smoke. Flames. Strong arms lifted her, carrying her through the thick air. She's okay, a voice called. Her mom. Emma's vision cleared just in time to see her mother running toward her. Her father set her down, and in the next second, Emma was wrapped in her mother's arms. She clung to her, her body trembling. James turned back toward the warehouse. The flames consumed it, thick plumes of smoke rising into the night sky. The leader, the real mastermind, was gone. But Emma wasn't stupid. She remembered Langston's last words. She remembered the phone call. This wasn't over. James pulled them both into his arms. We're safe now, he murmured. Emma's fingers dug into his jacket. She wanted to believe him. But deep down, she knew the truth. The people behind Langston, the ones pulling the strings, they wouldn't stop. They would come for them again. And next time, they might not be so lucky. But Emma wasn't afraid anymore. Because now, she was ready. Wow. What a journey! If you've been following from the beginning, let us know in the comments. Do you think Emma's fight is really over? Or is there more to this story? And if you loved this series, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so we can bring you more thrilling stories like this. Thanks for watching. Until next time.